and you find it helpful, please turn it to Luke chapter 2. Luke 2 is a long chapter. Every male Jew that lived within 15 miles of Jerusalem was required to go to Passover, the feast. And if you were a Jew that lived far away, 15 miles, by the way, if you're walking, is quite some distance, so that's a pretty good trip. But if you lived even further, I mean, you read about the Ethiopian eunuch who came to Passover, who came to Pentecost, which is not even a required festival, from Ethiopia. That's a very long trip. You were required as a Jew to try to come at least once. Every male Jew. Jesus' family, Mary and Joseph and Jesus himself, Jesus is now 12 years old, they are making that trip as we encounter this text. We've moved ahead now from the birth to 12 years later. Let's begin reading in verse 41. Every year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the feast of Passover. When he was 12, they went up to the feast according to the custom. After the feast was over, while his parents were returning home, Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but they were unaware that he had stayed behind. Thinking he was in their company, they traveled on for a whole day. Then they began to look for him amongst their relatives and friends, and when they didn't find him, they went back to Jerusalem to look for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And everyone who heard Jesus was amazed at his understanding and the answers that he was giving. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. I wonder if astonished is the best word. His mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us this way? Your father and I have been searching for you." "Why were you searching for me?" he asked. "Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house?" They didn't understand what he was saying to them. Neither would I have. Then they went down to Nazareth together. And Jesus was obedient to his parents, but his mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and people. Jesus is a Jewish boy, and this is a very significant time. Jesus is what is known in Judaism as bar mitzvah. Now we think about that as a ceremony, but it actually has a meaning. It means a son of mitzvah, the son of the law. Jesus at 12 years of age had become a son of the law. This meant that in Jewish understanding, he understood the law. And he understood where he was obedient and disobedient. That's why in common Protestant modern Christianity, you hear people say about the age of accountability, and most people locate that at 12. This is why. This history is why that is. So when they traveled in large groups of people. Why did they do that? Well, the distance from Galilee to Jerusalem is some trip, and it's not a safe trip. If you go and get a good map of Jerusalem, or Judea, I should say, and Galilee, which was seen as kind of almost in the area of the Samaritans. That's why it was called Galilee of the Gentiles. If you look at a map, the road is not some nice paved highway that comes between Jerusalem and Galilee. They traveled on little narrow pathways all through all of these rocky canyons and crags, plenty of places for bad people to hide. And so you traveled with other people. You didn't travel these roads alone. You remember the Good Samaritan, the whole story of that, the road between Jericho and Jerusalem. The reason the Samaritan, the man was found in the ditch is because he was by himself. You just didn't do that. You didn't travel by yourself. The women would typically go ahead with the children, and the men would follow. And this is probably how Jesus and Mary and Joseph made the trip. When the Passover was over, they go back. And they do the same thing. The groups of women and children would go ahead. Usually the men would lag behind. I don't know why, but they did. Maybe it's the same as it is today, where we lag behind so many things in our families as men when the women are going ahead. I mean, we're just... I see Joe nodding. I mean, she understands. I mean, there's a place where women are just smarter. We just got to face it. So they're smarter, and they go ahead, and Mary figures, well, Jesus is with Joe. Joe lags behind, sees Mary leave. There are hundreds of people. You got to realize they're not just 2 or 3. There's a large company of people. Jesus is with Mary and the other children. And they travel for a whole day. camp. They come to what would be the first camp as they travel, and they say, "Where's Jesus?" They get up the next morning to leave. "Where's Jesus? We don't know where he is." So what are we going to do? Well, there's only one thing you can do. If he's not with the group, nobody can find him. We got to go back to Jerusalem. So a whole day's travel back to Jerusalem, retracing their steps. I don't know how many people went with them. And they get to Jerusalem and they find Jesus just hanging around at the temple. I know what that feels like. And the text does not capture the emotion here. Mary was astonished. I'm going to say she was way more than any what a surprise. She's way more than that after 48 hours and plus of not knowing where Jesus is at 12 years old on these dangerous roads. I remember one time we were in Destin, and we chose Becky. Becky was so good at finding places for us to stay. They're always nice, and they got everything you need. This one had the longest pier in the Panhandle of Florida, which for Jackson is like nirvana. I mean, it's just, you got a 1,150-foot pier, and you can fish from one end to the other. Jackson's in heaven. So we left one morning to go to the pier. Now, you have to look at it from Rip's point of view. This meant that I was forced, we'll say it that way. Forced to spend the entire day in the sun, on the pier, no water, nothing to eat, nothing to drink, no comforts, no bench. I mean, the benches were always taken up instantly. So I'm just going to stand there all day long with Jackson. For him, that's nothing. We stay there all day. Come home for lunch, go back. I mean, there's just no reprieve here. And it's dark. Jackson would shut the piers down. Now, some of them closed at midnight. I don't like to stay up till midnight. He did. So Becky can tell you this is how it went. So we're on this pier. There are probably, I'm going to guess and say 2,000 people. There was not a space along the 1,100 feet, and both sides are completely full, and people are walking everywhere. 2,000 people. Easy. And Jackson comes over to me and says, "Daddy, I want to go home." And I'm thinking, oh man, isn't that great? You know, it's only 8:30. It's just getting dark, and we're going to get to go home now instead of going home at 10:30. Well, he sets his tackle box down in front of me. And I reach down and I look at the tackle box, and I'm closing the lid. And he was standing, his feet were against the box. I close the lid and I look up to leave, and he's gone. He's gone. Now it's dark. There are people everywhere. I have no idea where Jackson is. None. And I searched for him, carrying all this junk up and down this 1,150-foot pier, back and forth, looking everywhere I could possibly think to look. Never found him. So I'm thinking to myself, he must have gone home. So I take all the junk. I'm carrying everything, his stuff, my stuff, and I go back, and he's already come home by himself. I was not astonished like Mary here. That was not the sentiment that I had, was astonishment. So it's very customary. I know what this feels like. It's very customary in Passover. The Jewish men, women weren't allowed, would go and they would have theological conversations with the rabbis who would gather. Jesus is doing that. This was a very common thing. Entirely proper. But he's asking questions that are amazing, these rabbis. He's freaked his mom and dad out completely. And this would be what Luke spoke of in the passage we looked at last week when Simeon prophesied over Jesus when he was brought to the temple on the 8th day. There'll be a sword that's going to pierce your heart. This is one of those swords for Mary. They find him after traveling for 3 days, taking all that time to come back, and Jesus says, "Didn't you know that I had to be in the temple in the house of my Father?" I just can't imagine what Mary and Joseph thought of that. It says she treasured all these things in her heart. I'm going to say Luke is interviewing here many years after. And she's got the reflective time now to look back, and it becomes a treasure. I don't think it was a treasure when she found him in the temple. She is remembering these things because they are so significant. They know Jesus is unusual right away. Simeon tells them, Anna tells them, Elizabeth tells them. They recognize all of these features of Jesus as an infant, that this is somebody who's going to be very significant. The angel tells them he's going to be somebody significant. But Jesus' words there tell me something too when he says, "Didn't you know?" Of course they knew. But you can know things and they can still come as a surprise. And this was a surprise to his parents. For Mary, just like any parent, if we're sitting in here today, Becky and I, you all, we're all trusting God with our children and grandchildren. We're trusting God with them. For Mary, trusting God was even bigger, as she had to trust God with Jesus. She had this boy, and this boy forced her into trusting God in a way that she would never be able to imagine looking ahead. She had to come at it bit by bit, just like you and I come at it. And this episode is one of those doors opening up for her to see just what's going on. Mary and Joseph have got a gigantic challenge in their life. But I want to say something about this situation with Mary and Joseph. And this is what I want to funnel this down for you and for me today. There's a little spot in the letter to the Hebrews that tells me something about this moment for Mary and Joseph. They were perfectly safe. They were perfectly safe. In Hebrews chapter 6, it says in verse 13, when God made his promise to Abraham, he promised by himself because there was nobody greater to swear by. I will surely bless you and give you many descendants, he said to Abraham. And so after waiting patiently for a long time, Abraham received what was promised to him. People swear by someone greater than themselves. We all do that. I remember growing up as a kid, you swear on the Bible. I remember doing that in schoolyard conversations where I wanted to make sure that even if I was lying, somebody believed what I was saying. And the oath confirms what is said and puts an end to all argument. That's what you're trying to do on the schoolyard when you swear, when you say, I swear by the Bible. But because God wanted to make the unchanging nature of his purpose very clear to the heirs of what was promised, he confirmed it with an oath. He did so that by two unchangeable things, which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled to take hold of the hope offered to us can be encouraged. Mary and Joseph are perfectly safe here. They are perfectly safe. You see, God is trustworthy because how is he going to verify who he is? His namesake means something in this world. We sang that song that Lottie picked for us, that he's going to take care of us. What does that mean, that he's going to take care of us? Does it mean that we're just going to float on these cottony, billowy clouds of safety all the way to the grave? I don't think so. I don't think it means that at all. But there is a comfort there because we know something about the universe that we would not have known were that text not there. Think about that for a moment. I was reading in preparation for this sermon, and there was a story about this man who had this boy who he got a phone call twice a week from the school to come get this boy. He's in trouble again. He's done this, he's done that. Come sit down, you got to come to the office. He's sitting in there in the office. What did you do today? Well, this history went on for several school years until finally one day he got a phone call. And of course for this father, his arrangement with his wife was such that his job had the flexibility for him to be the one to go. So he was the one that was called. He went down there, total routine. What did he do today? Driving there thinking, what am I going to have to be told today? He gets there, he goes into the office, and the boy's not there. And the teacher says, I wanted you to know some things today, and so I made this list. And she stood up in front of the dad and read a list off of the good things that she saw in this boy's character. And then she said, that's all I had for you today. The guy says, what in the world? What is going on? So he goes home that night, and they're sitting around the table. The boy's sitting there. The boy doesn't know anything about it. The wife doesn't even know anything about it. The dad says, I had a meeting with your teachers today. The boy looks up. He's nervous. And the father tells the boy what had happened with the teacher. And when the boy hears the news, from that day forward, he was never a problem in school any longer. Why? Because he'd been told something from the outside about who he was. That changes everything. I know that Mary and Joseph made mistakes. They're just people like you and me. And the fact that it says Mary was astonished, I bet she was way more than astonished here. And I bet you read what it says in the text. It says, and then they went back to Nazareth, and Jesus became obedient to his parents so that he could fulfill the law in perfection. There is a comfort in knowing how things are going to go. I used to watch football, but this year was the first year I didn't. And I used to tape the games because people said, well, Rip, that's weird. I said, no, it's great. Because I can tape the game, and if I find out they won, I can enjoy that game from start to finish. All the pressure's off because I know how it's going to turn out. I've got the information I need in order to relieve me of all the tension. God gives us the same information. We sang it. He'll take care of you. The letter to the Hebrews, He's promised in a way that he could promise no greater, because he's sworn by himself to walk with us, to never leave us, never forsake us. There is something about that I need to learn how to take comfort in it. It's hard for us to see the outcomes, isn't it? We're just like Mary and Joseph. Here they are, all of this is happening in real time for them. Mary's astonished. No, she's not. She's really upset. They traveled for 3 days to come back to find Jesus safe. I'm sure they were glad. But man, I remember when I found Jackson at the apartment, my first impulse was, whew, and the second impulse was a lot different than astonished. Becky, we had a conversation where I let him know that I didn't appreciate the fact that he had disappeared like that. But you see, you and I'm saying this to myself, please don't mishear me. We are robbed of so much peace in this world by the fact that I do not trust the outcome. What is the outcome? It's given for us once to die. That's it. What happens, somebody talked about this at Mr. George's funeral. They read the poem of the dash. You know, where you look on a grave, it says 1952 to 2030, whatever. And that dash is your life. That's the person's life. And what is within that dash? What's in that? What does it mean? It means there's a lot of stuff where you and I are walking through this world that we cannot see what's really going on. We just don't I'm looking at Becky's and mine, Jackson's life right now and saying, I don't have a clue what's going on. I don't know. Somebody comes to me and asks me questions about it, you're looking at somebody who's as clueless as they could possibly be about what's happening. And I guarantee you that I look around the room and I see plenty of us who in this room, whether it's us or somebody we love, we're facing something that we are clueless about why this is going on and what it means. We've just got to walk through it. And yet, does God's care not play into that at all? Does it not matter that we know how it's going to turn out? You and I and everybody who calls the name of Jesus is going to stand before God one day, freed from everything we've ever done, and we're going to be with Him forever. That should mean something to us. Teresa of Calcutta. You may not know who Malcolm Muggeridge is, but he's a British author who was one of the main authors in what was known at the time, and maybe this magazine still exists, I don't know, you could look that up for yourself, called Punch. It's a British magazine. It's kind of like People or Vanity Fair. Just a kind of a general articles about life, some political, some social, some entertainment, whatever, science even. And he was one of the writers. And he wanted to go to Calcutta and spend months filming a BBC documentary about Teresa of Calcutta, Mother Teresa. And the documentary was called Something Beautiful for God. That was the name of it. But he was not a believer. He wasn't a believer. And she recognized in him the distance. I mean, you know how it is. If you're around somebody who doesn't believe for a little while, you pick up the fact that they don't really believe, right? It's not hard to see. I mean, some of the things that are said, the way questions are answered. So after that filming, he went back to England and she wrote him a letter. Teresa wrote Muggeridge a letter. And I'm going to read you the little portion of the letter. She says, "You are like Nicodemus." You remember Nicodemus. He came to Jesus. He was a teacher of the law. Came to Jesus at night so nobody'd see him because he didn't want anybody to know he was coming to talk to Jesus because it would have repercussions for his day gig. So he said, I'll come out in secret. You're like Nicodemus. And God's answer to Nicodemus is God's answer to you, Malcolm Muggeridge, unless you become like a child. Now, I'm sure, she goes on, I'm sure you'd understand everything beautifully if you would become like a little child in God's hands. You are longing for God, and the longing is so deep, and yet God keeps himself away from you. He's got to be forcing himself to do that because he loves you so much. Christ is longing to be your food, but surrounded with the fullness of living food, you allow yourself to starve. Is that not the case for us? For me, we're surrounded with the living food of who Jesus is. We are surrounded with the presence of God day in and day out, and we allow ourselves to starve because so many other things seem to intrude and take us away from enjoying the living food that God gives. And this has to be accepted like a child. There's no in between. There's no rational argument. There's no way to think it out. We've just got to come to him and cry out like a little child who's afraid. I'm afraid. Jesus, I'm afraid. Will you meet me here? Will you bring me the help? I remember last night laying in bed. I don't like going to bed these days because I'm concerned. And so once the lights are out, you're laying there and you roll over and get comfortable and you're ready to go to sleep. All of the thoughts of reality flood in. I don't know how it is for you. That's how it is for me. And all I could think of to say was, last night, Jesus, I need your help. I can't do this. I cannot face what's happening here. I say that to you all today, assuming, I look around the room, that everybody in here knows Jesus in that way. But can we covenant with God today? I want to do that. Can we covenant with God today to begin to pray like a little child and say, God, change me. Do whatever work you have to do in me, whatever you have to break, whatever has to be removed, whatever has to be put in, whatever has to be done that I can live in that safety that you grant for me and for you. Can we do that today? I don't know where